Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatorius. So, for anybody who keeps up to date with my videos, you will know that I have a new acquisition in my antique firearm collection. That being a Martini-Henry, as featured in the movie Zulu and The Men Who Would Be Kings and a bunch of other movies set in that era. So these came into service in the 1870s and stayed in service really until even after 1900 in some places, but in the British Army really until 1888 more or less. Okay, so we're looking at the rifle of the 1870s and 1880s, saw quite a lot of use. Now, for anybody who watched my last video, you will notice I have a new addition on the end of my rifle, and that is the pattern 1876 bayonet. Okay, so I got the rifle from Neil Aspenshaw of the Martini-Henry Society, and brilliant rifle. I've been cleaning it, sorting it out. It obviously had quite a bit of storage gunk on it and stuff, and I'm not fully there yet, but it's looking a lot cleaner than it was, and it's got lovely bore in the barrel, good rifling and everything. But I didn't have a bayonet, so I managed to pick one up. I went to War and Peace Revival, and it's an Enfield made and War Department stamped bayonet that at some point was sold to the Nepalese government, and so has some Nepalese markings on it, but it's a British made Enfield small arms factory made pattern 1876 bayonet. Now this is the longer bayonet. So initially the Martini-Henry, when it came out, didn't have its own bayonet for the simple reason that there were lots of socket bayonets already in storage, already in use in fact, for the Enfield and the Enfield Snyder. Now here's another rifle which I'm lucky enough to own. This one carried by the Oxfordshire Light Infantry during the Indian Mutiny probably, and this is the muzzle-loading Enfield rifled musket. So nothing goes in the back end of this except for a percussion cap, everything goes down the front end, and it's got a bayonet on it, as you can see. Now there are a few changes. So just to go back to what I was saying, this bayonet is the Enfield is the Enfield rifle bayonet that goes with this particular rifle, and because there were so many of these already in circulation, when the Martini-Henry came out, they thought, well, we'll just reuse these. There's no point making, you know, a spike with a socket is a spike with a socket, so we can fit these on the end of the Martini-Henry. All they needed to do was what's called bushing, or bush the socket at the back, for the simple reason that the Martini-Henry barrel is not as wide as the Enfield muzzleloader barrel. So they simply put essentially a tube inside the socket so that you could use this bayonet on the new Martini-Henrys. In fact, what I'll do is I'll just demonstrate to you what happens if you, let's put these down carefully, because these are obviously very old and worth a fair amount of money, so I don't want to throw them around. So I'll take the Martini-Henry bayonet off. So if we take the Enfield bayonet for a minute and just try putting that onto the Martini-Henry, you can see it's too big, it's too loose. So essentially they just inserted a tube inside here so it fitted on there. So this was the pattern 1853 bayonet, but when you're buying these, if you've got an Enfield or you've got a Martini-Henry, you've got to make sure whether it is bushed or not bushed to fit the rifle that you want it to fit on, because it won't fit on the other one. So initially they just issued these out to go onto the Martini-Henrys. So I'll show you somewhat what that looked like there. Now you will notice previously when I held the Enfield rifled musket with this mounted on, it came up probably about 6 inches further than this does. That is now down to about my mouth. Okay, yeah, okay, I'm 6'1", so I'm fairly tall for the standards of the 19th century, but this, however, was deemed to be a little bit short. So what they essentially did, and there were some other changes as well. I'll just put the rifle down for a second. Incidentally, it should be obvious, but that's because the Martini-Henry is a shorter rifle than the Enfield. I'll just show you that in comparison. So if I hold those up, you can see there's quite a substantial length difference between the Enfield rifled musket at the top and the Martini-Henry. So there were a few changes. Apart from bushing the socket, they decided to make the Martini-Henry version, or bayonet, the 76 model, which came out in 1876, obviously, with a socket which actually fits straight onto the Martini-Henry and obviously fit it. But you'll notice the blade is longer to make up for the lack of reach with the previous bayonet, because you had a longer rifle when this was made. But there is a slight change as well. If you look at the shapes of the blades, just to bring those a little bit closer, you can see that the Martini-Henry bayonet is straighter. There is another difference with the point. So if we look at the Enfield musket, you can see that the point is, or rather the slope to the point is sloped away here. And that is for a very simple and good reason. It is because this is a muzzle loader. So one of the problems with bayonets when you're dealing with muzzle loaders, let's put that on properly, lock it in, right. One of the problems is if I get my ramrod out, you imagine that, yeah, okay, I bite my top off my cartridge, I pour the powder down, stuff the paper, put the ball down with the paper, then I get my ramrod out, okay, there's the ramrod, turn the ramrod around and I go to ram it here. Okay, so the problem is at this point. You can see that my hand is coming into very close proximity to the bayonet. Now it's fine because this bayonet has two design features, show me its features, as Jorg Sprav would say, that mean that I don't stab my hand onto the end of my bayonet. Okay, number one, the bayonet's curved. Okay, it's not a trick of the light, it's not the lens, anything out. These bayonets for muzzle loaders are often curved slightly away or tilted slightly away from the line of the barrel so that you don't stab your hand. And additionally, the slope there bringing the point to the outside line of the bayonet means that if you do clip it, hopefully most of the time you'll slip down the inside line and you won't stab your hand. Once you've got a, let's put that down. Once you've got a breech loader, such as the Martini-Henry here, you don't need to worry about that anymore. So they put the point centrally aligned and had a straight bayonet. Now what I'll do is I'll fit this onto my Martini-Henry, put the locking ring on and stand them both up. And what is the height difference between them now? Very little. I think there's about 1.5 inches, or let's say about 3 centimeters, something like that. Yeah, about 3 centimeters difference in reach. So the Enfield, the earlier Enfield muzzle loader, does have a very slight reach advantage over the Martini-Henry, but you know, nothing to write home about, nothing really big. So they simply made up for the reduction in the length of the rifle with an increase in the reach of the bayonet, and changed the design slightly so it was more suited to a breech loader. Which is better? Is either one better? That's a big question. I think ultimately the advantage of the Enfield musket is that it is, I believe, slightly lighter, although I haven't actually weighed both of these. But you've got more stock, or more haft, shall we say, and less blade. Is there any advantage or disadvantage to that? I don't really know, not as far as I can see, really. I don't think there's really a huge amount of difference between the two. One thing I would say, if I just put one of these, I put the Martini-Henry down for a second. One thing I would say is that sometimes you get things locked into here, especially if someone's thrusting at you with another bayonet. So say, for example, I'm on guard with my bayonet and someone thrusts their bayonet at me. Often you can push the thing aside, particularly on the inside line, of course, with that crook there. Becomes a bit like the arm or extension on a winged spear or a spontoon or a partisan or something like that. So you can guide things aside with that sort of hook section. That hook section is closer to the opponent with this than it is with the Martini-Henry. Okay, so it does mean that you can keep blades and other people's weapons slightly further away from you with this weapon. Having said that, in terms of inertia, it means that this portion of the rifle is taken up with, or this portion of the weapon is taken up with rifle. So that much barrel and stock and ramrod is heavier than the equivalent length of just a thin piece of steel bayonet would be. In terms of stabbing, there's not a huge amount of difference. I prefer a central point to an offset point, so I think that in terms of penetration, you're probably going to get deeper penetration and easier penetration with the Martini-Henry central point and straighter blade as well. Straighter blade means the force isn't being deflected to either side. That being said, you could suffer from a point of over penetration, and nobody likes over penetration. Why? Because quite simply, there is only a certain amount of blade, let's say about 5 inches of blade, which is going to go into someone's body. At that point, it's going to be exiting their body on the other side usually, unless you hit them at some strange kind of angle, and I'll mention something about that in a minute. So anything that goes through their body and out of the back is wasted. It doesn't do them any more damage, and equally it means that they come closer to you. So one of the problems is when you run a bayonet through someone's body, it will come up to the muzzle of the rifle. And in the case of the Martini-Henry, it will mean that your opponent who's just been run through may still be alive, because this might not have killed them. They might just be impaled on the end of your weapon and trying to hit you back or stab you back. And it means that they're closer to you. So in that sense, I would say the Enfield has the advantage because it keeps the opponent further away, as well as having those extra 3 centimeters of reach. The muzzle being further away, essentially, if you think like a boar spear or a spontoon, which has a bar across it, has a similar effect to that. It keeps the person's body further away from you, and if their body's further away, they're less likely to be able to hit you with a tulwar or an assegai or whatever they're trying to hit you with. But one final thing, I'll talk about over penetration. So there is a case from the Afghan War of 1879, 80, something like that, 1880, 81, where someone was charged by an insurgent in Afghanistan. They had didn't have time to reload, so they braced their Martini-Henry. They were using the long bayonet by this point, braced it, and the point entered at the opponent's navel and exited out of the back of their neck. Indeed, if I hold the bayonet down here at my navel, you can see that it does reach from my navel to the back of my neck. So plausible, grim, horrible, and macabrely interesting, I suppose, from a student of weapons point of view. But that does mean that the opponent is going to be very close to you if they run right the way up to your muzzle, or indeed if it was a horse or something like that, and someone who's trying to run you down or lance you or whatever. It does mean that they end up very close to you. So there we go, a relatively brief comparison of the Martini-Henry and the Enfield bayonets mounted on the rifles, and also an explanation of why the spiked socket bayonet changed slightly as we move from muzzle loaders to breech loaders, because you don't have that worry about having to ram things down the barrel from the front end anymore. Hope that's been somewhat interesting. See you for the next video, folks. Cheers. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.